Alright, so now we're going to look at the... Okay, so we already said the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So now we're going to talk about the functions of the brain in this chapter. And what it's saying at the bottom, the meninges. Meninges are protective coverings of the brain. So underneath the skull, the first covering is the dura mater. Dura mater is the thickest and the strongest. The middle covering is the arachnoid. And the covering that is directly on the brain, or the innermost covering, is the pia mater. And so this picture is just showing those coverings. The dura mater, again, is saying the outer layer, the toughest. We're also going to learn about these dural sinuses. These are the veins. We're going to learn that there's the superior sagittal sinus that runs from the front to the back of the brain, mid-sagittally. Very important. Okay, so underneath the dura mater is the arachnoid. We're going to see that the arachnoid matter looks like spider webbing. And so what we're seeing on the picture, these white lines, that's the arachnoid matter, kind of extending down. But so then where these white lines are, the space in between them, that's the subarachnoid space. Okay, and so we're going to see that in this space, there's the fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid. And the deepest covering, the thinnest, is then the pia mater. Okay, so know the order of the coverings from the outermost to the innermost. Okay, so these coverings, these meninges, are not only around the brain, but they're also around the spinal cord, and that's what this picture is showing. Okay, CSF. CSF stands for the cerebrospinal fluid. This is produced in ventricles. Ventricles are just spaces inside the brain. Okay, so these blue shapes on these pictures, those are the ventricles. So there are 4 ventricles, 2 lateral ventricles. So if you look at this picture, this C shape with the tail is a lateral ventricle. And so there's a lateral ventricle inside each half of the brain. Then the 3rd ventricle, this is in the area of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So this shape here is the 3rd ventricle. And the 4th ventricle is the space right in front of the cerebellum. Okay, so study these on the pictures that I provided for you. The interventricular foramen, this is the connection between the lateral ventricle and the 3rd ventricle. And the cerebral aqueduct is the connection between the 3rd and the 4th ventricle. Alright, the cerebrospinal fluid is made by the choroid plexus. Choroid plexus has these special cells that filter the blood and to get the nutrients out of it and to keep out the toxins. But yeah, so the cerebrospinal fluid has a lot of nutrients, it has oxygen, different growth factors, hormones. And so it's saying nutritive, also protective, helps maintain the ionic concentrations, so it brings in sodium, potassium. We've seen how important they are for the action potentials. So first, the cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the choroid plexus, and the choroid plexus is found in all of the ventricles. Okay, so know that. So then after the fluid gets produced in the ventricles, it flows through the ventricles. So from the lateral ventricle, which is about this region, to the 3rd ventricle, to the 4th ventricle. Okay, so then the fluid is going to go around the brain, and it also goes around the spinal cord. So here, this light blue part is the subarachnoid space. Okay, so here, this fluid goes around this part, also goes around the spinal cord. Then after it circulates, the cerebrospinal fluid goes through these little connections at the top. These are called the arachnoid granulations. So think of them as little entrances. So then these entrances go into the superior sagittal sinus. So here on the picture, the dark blue part is the superior sagittal sinus, which is just a vein. So they call the big veins sinuses. So then the sinus takes the cerebrospinal fluid back into the blood circulation because the fluid first came from the blood. So go here, the flow of CSF, know that it first flows inside the ventricles. Again, it's made by the choroid plexus. So then after it flows through the ventricles, it goes into the subarachnoid space. this subarachnoid space goes around our brain and the spinal cord. After the subarachnoid space, the fluid goes through those tiny little entrances called the arachnoid granulations, also known as the arachnoid villi. Okay, so then these arachnoid granulations are connecting to the superior sagittal sinus. There are also these other sinuses. There's an inferior sagittal sinus, sigmoid sinus, straight sinus. These are all veins in the brain. But so then after those sinuses, then the fluid is going to go into the jugular vein. Jugular vein is in the neck. Jugular vein then takes the fluid to the heart. And so here, you're sending the fluid back into the blood circulation. Okay, so know this order. Okay, if there is a blockage in the cerebrospinal fluid flow, then it will lead to this increased pressure in the brain. And so then the fluid puts pressure on the brain and causes injury to the brain. But so the pressure can be relieved by inserting a drain or a shunt. So this is often seen in some children and infants, but it can be treated by insertion of a shunt. Traumatic brain injury, result of an attack, an injury. Concussion means a mild traumatic brain injury. What happens in brain injuries is that axons tear away from the neurons. And so then the neuron is damaged. It's not able to regenerate because if you remember, oligodendrocytes prevent repair. And so now when the axon has torn away from the neuron actually ends up dying. And when the neuron dies, it releases these chemicals and it actually then causes other healthy neurons to die. So that's why brain injuries are very, very dangerous, because it just the injury just continues to detriment effects. Okay, the portions of the brain. Cerebrum just means the main part of the brain that you see. Diencephalon is this middle part. We're going to learn that it includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Cerebellum is our little brain. And the brainstem is this part. And we're going to learn that the brainstem includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Okay, and so this is showing the lobes of the brain. The frontal lobe is in the front of the brain. This is where the thinking occurs, the decision making. We're also going to see the motor functions. In the frontal lobe, only this ridge here is called the precentral gyrus. Okay, so gyrus just refers to this hill, the ridge of the brain. Central sulcus is the separation, just this line. It's not on the brain, but it just means the separation of the brain. So the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So here the parietal lobe is this blue part. Okay, then the parietal lobe has the postcentral gyrus. And so here the postcentral gyrus is only this part of the brain. Okay, so only that ridge. Okay, then we're also seeing these other lobes, the occipital lobes on the back of the brain. Cerebellum was that little brain, temporal lobe, the side. But so when you pull the temporal lobe, you're going to see this hidden lobe underneath it. This hidden lobe is called the insula. So there is a separation where you can pull the temporal lobe. That separation on the side of the brain is called the lateral sulcus. Now this is looking at the top of the brain. The separation between the left and the right halves, or the hemispheres of the brain, is a longitudinal fissure. Now this picture is also showing the veins. On the right side they removed the veins, but so these veins are held down by the arachnoid matter. So that's what you're seeing, this shiny material here, shiny substance. Arachnoid matter holds down those veins. So on the other side they removed the arachnoid matter, but attached directly on the brain is the pia mater. you're seeing here. So that shiny stuff on the brain. Okay, organization of the brain. Gray matter. Gray matter, you're going to see a difference in the color in the brain, the parts of the brain. The brain parts that are darker are called the gray matter because here they're neuron cell bodies, the dendrites, glial cells. But the parts of the brain that are lighter in color are called the white matter. They appear white because here there are a lot of myelinated axons. And myelin's color is whiter. Yeah, so just know what gray matter contains versus the white matter. Okay, so then next in the second part of this, we're gonna look at the functions of the different lobes. And so what this is just kind of giving an overview of the brain functions. Of course, interpreting impulses, voluntary movements are uh, the job of the brain, storing information, retrieving stored information, reasoning, intelligence, personality. So all functions of the brain.